Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 to 53, otherwise known as the zombie story, is a masterclass in biblical absurdity. It shows just how far the authors were willing to go with their fairy tale, happily inventing scenes out of thin air when the drama needed a boost.
At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people.
Given the magnitude of this event, more fantastic in sheer numbers than Jesus' own resurrection, you'd think they would be documented widely by historians, religious figures, and anyone in the region. Oddly enough, there's no corroboration. We're not asking, are there any Roman, Jewish, or independent records of this event? After all, when it comes to the Gospels, the resurrection, the empty tomb, or Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, we're already working with a very sparse historical record. What we're really asking is much simpler. Why didn't the early Christians themselves record such an astonishing event? Paul doesn't mention it, Luke doesn't mention it, Mark doesn't mention it, even John doesn't mention it. You'd expect at least a footnote, not total radio silence, which makes this one of the clearest this never happened moments in the entire Bible.
Of all of the things in the world that have never happened, that has never happened the most. That is the most didn't happen shit of all time.
Christian apologists, or in this case, more like excuse-gists, understanding the gravity of this silence, know how bad it looks. So what do? Exactly what they always do.
Christians don't talk about this verse because they're not able to account for it.
We talk about it all the time because you guys won't shut up about it.
We don't shut up about it because, frankly, it's hilarious. It's in the same comedy league as the moon splitting in half or the sun standing still in the sky for a whole day so a battle could finish. Whenever Michael runs into an error in his book that makes him squirm, he immediately pulls out the classic metaphor escape card, even if literally no one in 2,000 years ever read the verse as a metaphor, which is absurd, even by biblical miracle standards.
We can see Joshua is not at all recording the sun literally stop moving in the sky, and we've been misinterpreting this passage for centuries.
No, Michael. It's not that we've been misinterpreting it for centuries. If everyone misunderstood it the same way, that's either because A, the author had zero idea how the world works, or B, God is the worst communicator since that one uncle who only texts in emojis. But of course, you can't admit either of those, because then the holy book might look human, and next thing you know, atheism. And that's scary. That's why I think his "you guys won't shut up" face is adorable. He's not really angry at skeptics. He's frustrated that we keep pointing out the obvious absurdities in his book, and he's got nothing to come back with. Mike Licona lost his job because he dared to say, maybe this was figurative, and his fellow Christians were like, blasphemy, get out. And that was the end of that.
Evangelical, a number of my evangelical brothers and sisters took issue with my view on it.
So yeah, let's talk about it here. Just maybe don't bring up the zombie thing during your next job interview, especially if your boss is a Christian. Not the best career move.
There wouldn't have been any zombies because these people would have been resuscitated, like Lazarus was. He was a person who came back to life. He wasn't a reanimated corpse.
Because changing the terminology magically fixes the problem, right? Definitions can be tricky, Michael, so let's not kill the fun here. Especially when Matthew doesn't bother to clarify a single thing. He just flat out says people came out of tombs and wandered into town after being dead. To me, that's a zombie story, my friend. Totally normal and perfectly reasonable reaction to what's happening on the page. The fault lies with the author, who is trying to pass off a lie as truth, not with the skeptics for pointing out the obvious. But sure, call it resuscitation, resurrection, miraculous healing, or even holy sleepwalking if it helps you rest at night. It's still corpses coming back for a walk around.
Second, it would not have been a lot of people, let alone an apocalypse. In that day and age, only the wealthy could afford tombs, and it says only the godly men and women came out. In that time and region, bodies would only be in tombs for about a year. After that, relatives would go back in, collect the bones, and then place them in a bone box. So we're only talking about the godly, from the wealthy, of the people who had died the past year in or around Jerusalem. So maybe a few dozen.
Hold your beer, detective. You're overthinking this for Matthew's sake. We're not talking about what actually happened here. We're talking about what Matthew imagined happened. We're all living in his head now. Calling it a zombie apocalypse is really just a modern translation of the chaos Matthew describes, especially when he didn't say a few dozen or some. He said many. That could be hundreds, maybe even thousands. If that's inaccurate, that's Matthew's fault for being vague. Besides, maybe Jerusalem had a particularly godly and wealthy year. Who's to say? That's all just speculation on your part.
But that might not be what Matthew is trying to say. The scholar Mike Licona has made the case that Matthew was probably just using poetic or apocalyptic language of the time. It'd be sort of like if I said Jesus' death was so climactic, hell froze over. You obviously understand that's not literal.
Hell froze over is a phrase we all use, and it's universally understood to mean something impossible or shocking. It's an expression that everyone gets, and if someone doesn't, well, they might have bigger issues to deal with than metaphors. But Matthew's version of hell froze over? That one seems to have left everyone completely confused. No one understood it. Not the early church fathers, not even most Christians today. That is, until we started talking and wouldn't shut up about it, of course. So seriously, what's the point of using a metaphor that nobody gets? That's like telling a joke no one laughs at. Look, if we're going to make everything a metaphor, then what's to stop us from saying that Jesus walking on water was just poetic, or that feeding 5,000 people was a spiritual lesson about generosity? I mean, hey, maybe even the resurrection was just a metaphor. Who's to say? How can a reader figure out where the fiction stops and reliable history begins? The details in this passage are way too specific to be poetic language. This is getting ridiculous, even for you. I mean, if Christianity happens to be the truth, then, my friend, you're standing on the wrong side of it. Let's lay out the two distinct events. Jesus dies, and the tombs break open. Many dead bodies rise. Post-resurrection, these risen bodies wander into Jerusalem and appear to many people. Now tell me, how is that figurative language? The details are painstakingly specific. Either Matthew's original audience thought this was a real event, and we've got some serious explaining to do, since no one else wrote about it, or we're looking at a later reinterpretation, trying to dodge the uncomfortable fact that this sounds, well, like a zombie apocalypse.
Licona surveyed other texts from the time that talked about other figures dying, and he notes we see similar language in them. And then he says, "It seems to me that an understanding of the language in Matthew 27:52-53 as special effects with eschatological Jewish texts and thoughts in mind is most plausible."
Look, this really isn't that complicated. If those other ancient accounts were understood literally by their audiences, then the authors must have been imagining the same kind of wild events that Matthew was describing. I mean, if they took literal celestial signs, earthquakes, and walking dead seriously, then it's no different from Matthew's account of the tombs opening and the saints rising. If those events were meant to be understood symbolically, if the unusual occurrences surrounding the deaths of figures like Caesar were seen as poetic or figurative, then that really doesn't help us interpret the zombie scenario in Matthew. The issue is that, in Matthew's case, nobody understood it as metaphor. When a text presents something as if it really happened, one of three things must be true. The author genuinely believed it happened. The author wanted the readers to believe it happened. The readers themselves did, in fact, believe it happened. And when it comes to Matthew's story of a mass resurrection, it's hard to escape the conclusion that ancient readers understood it as literal history. It wasn't written like poetry, it wasn't framed as symbolism. It was told straight as an event.
Matthew may simply be emphasizing that a great king has died. If he has one or more of the Jewish texts in mind, he may be proclaiming that the day of the Lord has come.
First of all, Jesus wasn't a king. He never fulfilled the prophecy that the Messiah would rule Israel as a king and establish a kingdom. The one described in the prophecy was supposed to actually take the throne, which means Jesus wasn't the figure those prophecies were pointing to.
33, yeah. Did Jesus rescue Israel and Judah and allow them to live in safety?
Yeah.
When?
Well,
Show me in the Bible where it happened.
One, you're not going to like this, obviously. Spiritually. Two,
spiritual.
it's a gradual thing. Can you let me answer?
Do you pay your taxes spiritually?
Cornelius a Lapide directly comments on this and clearly shows that the early fathers took it at face value. He names Bede, Theophylact, and Saint Jerome, and says Jerome believed the graves were opened in token of the future resurrection. So Jerome saw it as symbolic in meaning, yes, but also as a real historical event. Lapide also brings in St. Ambrose and St. Hilary. Hilary says, illuminating the darkness of death, and lighting up the gloom of the pit, he robbed death of its spoils in order to mark the resurrection of the dead who are now asleep, and then say, "They rose then that Christ might confirm the truth of his resurrection by those his companions who announced it, and, again, that in and through them Christ might manifest the power of his passion, that just as the souls of the patriarchs were freed by it from the pit, so, mystically, would men's souls, which were dead in sin, be now quickened by his grace, and themselves rise gloriously at last to a blessed and eternal life."
Bullshit.
In other words, it's very easy for Christians to account for this passage. You just need to use a little critical thinking and do some research.
And that's how you graduate from apologist to excuse gist. Have a nice day.